Have you ever stood perfectly still while a man ground your hard work into the toxic mud? Knowing you would be the one to sign his termination papers exactly 4 days later, they always underestimate the silence of a woman backed into a corner. While my boss laughed in my face, I was quietly building a flawless trap. The sweetest revenge is never a loud scream. It is using the enemy's own rules to take absolutely everything. Welcome, dear listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. As you may know, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep bringing you these intense experiences. If you enjoy our content, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you will find exclusive, longer, and more detailed true stories featuring multiple emotional voices that we simply cannot make public here. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or pinned comment. Now, let us dive into today's story, where you will meet a woman named Lila Morales. I am 34 years old, and I serve as the head of ecological analysis at Verticore Synthetics. We are a massive agricultural technology corporation, the kind of towering giant that swallows smaller farming communities whole and treats the earth like a disposable chemistry set. Currently, my department is stationed at the primary testing fields in Crimson Valley, Ohio. We are running aggressive field trials on a new proprietary super fertilizer. The land here stretches out for miles, but it is far from the picturesque golden farmlands you might see on glossy postcards. It is a brutal, industrialized grid of thick steel pipes, automated sensor nodes, and turned soil that perpetually smells of sulfur, bleach, and something uniquely synthetic. It was a bleak Tuesday morning, entirely consumed by a suffocating, sticky drizzle that seemed to cling to my skin and clothes like a heavy second layer of sweat. The air was thick, humid, and tasted metallic on the tongue. I zipped up my waterproof jacket and walked out into the treacherous field, clutching my third urgent risk assessment report of the month. My target was Vance Sterling, our regional director. Vance was a man who looked entirely out of place in a muddy agricultural zone. He was always slick, meticulously groomed, and exuded an aura of inherited wealth and unearned arrogance. He harbored a profound, thinly veiled disdain for women in technical roles, treating my entire ecological department as nothing more than an irritating obstacle to his quarterly profit margins. The heavy document in my hands was not just another routine compliance check or minor bureaucratic hurdle. It was an undeniable death sentence for the entire valley. My team and I had spent 3 agonizing, sleepless nights cross-referencing the deep soil core samples. The data we pulled was horrifyingly clear. Verticore's new chemical compound was severely unstable. It was rapidly leaking past the designated containment barriers and seeping directly into the local groundwater supply. Worse still, it was triggering a cascading secondary reaction that systematically annihilated the essential microbial life in the earth. If we did not halt the trial immediately, the chemical spread would irreversibly sterilize thousands of acres of surrounding independent farmlands within exactly 6 months. It would be an ecological catastrophe of unprecedented proportions, ruining countless livelihoods. I found Vance standing right in the middle of Sector 4, a particularly desolate patch of churned, muddy earth. He was surrounded by his usual echo chamber of middle management cronies, all of them wearing identical high-visibility vests over their inappropriately expensive clothes. Vance had a thick, pungent cigar clamped tightly between his teeth, the sweet smoke cutting sharply through the acrid, chemical smell of the experimental fertilizer. I stepped right up to him, the heavy rubber boots I wore sinking more than an inch into the wet muck. I held out the report toward his chest. He did not even bother to take the cigar out of his mouth. He just tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning the bold red text on the cover page with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt, exactly as if I were handing him a piece of discarded street trash. He finally took the document from my outstretched hands, pinching the top corner of the heavy 40-page packet casually between his thumb and forefinger. He did not flip the cover open. He did not read a single line of the carefully drafted executive summary. Instead, he locked his cold eyes directly onto mine, a cruel, knowing smirk playing on his lips, and he simply let his fingers open. I watched the thick stack of papers plummet downward in agonizing slow motion. It landed with a loud, wet slap right into a deep puddle of black, chemical-laced mud directly at our feet. The toxic water immediately soaked through the crisp white pages, blurring the hard data my team had fought so tirelessly to compile. But Vance was not finished making his point. He lifted his right foot, clad in an absurdly expensive pair of genuine snakeskin cowboy boots, and deliberately stepped squarely onto the center of the report, grinding the paper deep into the toxic sludge with his heel. The sycophants surrounding him immediately fell silent, eagerly waiting for their boss to deliver his punchline. Vance exhaled a thick, gray cloud of cigar smoke directly into my face and let out a sharp laugh. It was a cold, practiced sound designed to humiliate. "Go back to the office and type out some whining emails, sweetheart," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the heavy hum of the industrial machinery operating nearby. "This place generates billions of dollars. It is not a place for weak girls who are afraid of getting their shoes dirty. Leave the real work to the men who understand what it takes to win." The group of managers instantly erupted into a chorus of boisterous, sycophantic laughter, their mocking voices grating harshly against the dull roar of the water pumps. I stood perfectly still. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a single word of heated protest. Arguing with a man like Vance in front of his captive audience was exactly what he wanted. He fed on the emotional reactions of those he considered hopelessly beneath him. So, I starved him of that satisfaction. I slowly bent my knees, lowering myself directly into the foul-smelling mud. I reached my bare hands into the freezing black water, my fingers closing tightly around the ruined, soaking wet mass of paper. The mud was icy and sharp with chemical grit. I pulled the heavy, dripping report free from the strong suction of the puddle. I stood back up, clutching the ruined document tightly to my side, allowing the black sludge to drip freely down my leg and onto the ground. I did not look at Vance again. I simply turned my back to him and his men, beginning the long, silent walk back to the field laboratory. Behind me, the loud, booming laughter of the men continued to echo across the bleak Ohio fields, but all I could hear was the steady, rhythmic countdown of a trap starting in my head. The door to my field laboratory closed with a heavy, metallic thud, instantly cutting off the relentless drone of the agricultural machinery outside. The space I commanded was little more than a retrofitted shipping container, poorly insulated and perpetually smelling of ozone, stale coffee, and the faint, bitter tang of the chemical fertilizers outside. I walked over to my heavy metal desk, my mud-caked boots leaving thick, dark, deliberate tracks across the cheap linoleum floor. I sat down in my rigid, uncomfortable chair, placing the ruined, foul-smelling document flat on the center of the scratched surface. With slow, methodical movements, I pulled a thick roll of industrial paper towels from the wall dispenser. I tore off a sheet and began to meticulously wipe the toxic, corrosive sludge from the clear plastic cover of the report. The burning anger that had been rising in the back of my throat out on the open field was entirely gone now. It had not dissipated. Rather, it had flash-frozen into a state of absolute razor-sharp clarity and cold, calculating logic. A lesser employee, driven purely by emotion, would have immediately opened their email client and drafted a furious, rambling message to human resources. They would have angrily cited hostile work environments, blatant corporate sexism, and gross professional misconduct. I did not even entertain the thought for a single second. Human resources at Verticore Synthetics was not designed to protect the employees. It was a carefully structured, highly paid shield meant entirely to protect the company from liability. Filing a formal grievance against Vance Sterling would be the equivalent of professional suicide. Vance was not just an arrogant manager. He was the direct nephew of a senior executive board member. His family name was literally carved into the marble foundation stones of the corporate headquarters in Chicago. A complaint from a mid-level ecological analyst would be quietly intercepted, buried within 24 hours. And I would inevitably find myself permanently reassigned to a dead-end, meaningless desk job in a windowless basement before the end of the week. I needed a weapon that bypassed the internal corporate hierarchy entirely, something completely immune to his family's influence. As I stared blankly at the faint, muddy imprint of Vance's expensive snakeskin boot, still clearly visible on the title page, a specific, deeply buried data protocol surfaced in my memory. Exactly 2 years ago, Verticor had faced a massive, highly publicized public relations nightmare following a minor, yet highly visible, chemical spill in a neighboring state. To quickly appease furious environmental activists and satisfy panicked federal regulators, the board of directors had commissioned the rapid creation of a highly publicized artificial intelligence transparency portal. They dramatically named it the Aegis Node. It was supposedly designed to automatically scan, aggregate, and analyze environmental risk data in real time. However, in reality, it was purely a cosmetic gesture, a brilliant, multi-million-dollar piece of corporate greenwashing. Upper management had deliberately hidden the administrative access keys deep within the labyrinth of the IT department, ensuring no regular employee ever actually utilized it. They were terrified of the system for one very specific, highly technical reason: to conclusively prove its absolute transparency to the skeptical public. The software engineers had hardwired the Aegis node to instantly mirror all of its critical findings directly to the automated risk assessment portals of major Wall Street investment funds. I opened my secure, reinforced workstation terminal and initiated a deep system search. It took me nearly 45 minutes of painstakingly navigating through archaic, intentionally convoluted server directories before I finally located the dormant backdoor login interface. Using my emergency, highly encrypted ecological disaster clearance credentials, I typed the long string of command lines. The bright terminal screen flickered rapidly, shifting from the standard corporate blue interface to a harsh, minimalist terminal black. A pulsing green cursor appeared, followed almost immediately by a dense block of system prompts indicating that the Aegis node was currently in a state of deep, undisturbed hibernation. It had never received a single, solitary data packet since the day it was officially launched. With a sequence of rapid, practiced keystrokes, I forcefully bypassed the sleep protocol and commanded the artificial intelligence core to wake up. I did not just intend to submit the ruined text report. If I was going to intentionally trigger a highly sensitive global financial algorithm, I needed to feed it an overwhelming avalanche of irrefutable, catastrophic data. I connected my workstation directly to the encrypted storage drives of the external field sensors. First, I uploaded the high-resolution, cleanly scanned digital portable document format copy of my original, unaltered ecological risk assessment. Next, I pulled the raw, unfiltered chemical telemetry logs directly from the deep underground soil probes. I then attached the high-definition infrared satellite imagery my team had captured just 3 days ago. The heat maps were absolutely terrifying to look at. The massive areas where the experimental superfertilizer had heavily seeped were glowing brightly in violent shades of sickly purple and pitch black, indicating a complete, irreversible, and total eradication of all thermal biological activity in the deep soil. It was an undeniable visual confirmation of a rapidly dying Earth. But raw scientific data can always be delayed, debated, or entirely disputed by armies of expensive corporate lawyers. I needed absolute, undeniable proof of malicious, intentional negligence from upper management. I swiftly accessed the internal corporate security network, bypassing the standard firewall, and pulled the heavily encrypted video feed from the meteorological observation tower situated directly above Sector 4. I scrubbed back through the digital timeline until I found the exact timestamp of my humiliating interaction with Vance. The high-definition digital camera had captured every single detail perfectly. The video file clearly showed Vance arrogantly taking the report, deliberately dropping it into the toxic puddle, and viciously grinding his heel deeply into the paper. I ran the associated audio track through a quick, automated enhancement filter, isolating his distinct voice over the loud, chaotic hum of the heavy machinery, his mocking. Cruel words echoed clearly and sharply through my heavy desk headphones. Go back to the office and type out some whining emails. Sweetheart, this place generates billions of dollars. It is not a place for weak girls who are afraid of getting their shoes dirty. I carefully packaged the damning video file, the infrared satellite imagery, the raw sensor telemetry, and the comprehensive 40-page ecological report into one massive, heavily encrypted digital archive. I moved my cursor slowly to the blinking input field for the primary system alert designation. I knew exactly what was currently at stake in the executive boardrooms. Verticore Synthetics was right in the middle of the final, highly sensitive, and strictly confidential stages of negotiating a massive corporate buyout. A massive multinational conglomerate was actively preparing to acquire our entire operation for exactly $5 billion. Any sudden sign of massive environmental liability would instantly destroy the entire deal. With slow, precise, and heavy keystrokes, I typed out the official file designation Level 4 Ecological Risk Concealment - Direct Threat to Autumn Acquisition Agreement. The Aegis node artificial intelligence instantly accepted the parameters without a single moment of hesitation. I hovered my index finger directly over the enter key for a fraction of a second, feeling the immense weight of what I was about to unleash. The cramped office was completely dead silent, save for the steady, mechanical hum of the cooling fans inside the servers. I pressed the key down firmly. The screen immediately flashed with a bright green confirmation message as the massive synchronization process initiated, silently pushing the catastrophic data packet straight past the corporate firewalls and out into the global financial web. The upload process dropped silently into the background. I calmly closed the terminal application, wiped my desk completely clean of any remaining traces of mud, grabbed my wet jacket, and walked out the door back into the cold drizzle, leaving the quiet, invisible, ticking time bomb to do its devastating work. The next 72 hours stretched out with an agonizing, heavy tension that seemed to suffocate the entire testing facility. If Vance felt any impending sense of doom, he completely masked it with a drastic escalation of his already insufferable arrogance, drunk on the anticipation of the upcoming multi-billion-dollar acquisition. He began parading around the site like a feudal lord who had just conquered a new territory. His retaliation for my silent defiance in the mud was swift and predictably petty. On Thursday morning, I received a cold, automated notification from the Central Accounting Department. My field laboratory budget had been abruptly slashed by exactly 60%. Essential requisitions for heavy-duty hazmat filters and sterilization chemicals were flatly denied. When I confronted him about the missing supplies outside the main equipment shed, he leaned against the side of his pristine luxury truck and offered a cruel, yellow-toothed smile. He casually informed me that he had already drafted the paperwork for my permanent reassignment. He promised that the moment the merger was finalized, I would be shipped off to a dilapidated, underfunded ecological monitoring outpost located 300 miles north of Anchorage, Alaska, where my only company would be frozen permafrost and starving wildlife. He thought the threat of professional exile would finally break my spirit. He had absolutely no idea that his entire empire was already beginning to collapse beneath his expensive leather boots. While Vance strutted through the toxic mud, completely oblivious to the invisible guillotine hanging directly over his neck, I spent every spare moment locked inside my retrofitted shipping container, meticulously monitoring the heavily encrypted digital traffic on the Aegis node. For the first 48 hours, the system logs remained stubbornly empty. The silence was deafening, a psychological weight that threatened to crack my carefully maintained composure. But late Friday afternoon, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred within the server architecture. The data packet I had uploaded stopped pinging the void. The access registry suddenly updated. The system had not triggered a mass automated alert, nor had it been swept up by a generic Wall Street trading algorithm. Instead, My catastrophic risk assessment had attracted exactly one highly specific, deeply secured viewer. The user identification tag was completely stripped of any corporate branding or personal data, displaying only a stark, alphanumeric string V-alpha-01. This was not a mindless web crawler. The dwell time on the uploaded surveillance video and the infrared satellite heat maps indicated that a living, breathing human being was actively dissecting every single piece of evidence I had provided. The physical world soon began to violently mirror the digital shockwaves I had set into motion. The very first tangible anomaly manifested on Monday morning. The heavy 18-wheel supply trucks that delivered our specialized chemical catalysts strictly at 6 o'clock every morning simply failed to arrive. The massive steel gates of the compound remained firmly shut. Then came the observers. From the narrow, reinforced window of my field lab, I spotted 3 unmarked, matte black sports utility vehicles parked silently just beyond the absolute outer boundary of our agricultural zone. Men in sharp, impeccably tailored dark suits emerged. They did not wear our company colors. They did not request entry into the main facility. They simply stood at the perimeter, quietly deploying their own portable core drilling equipment to extract deep soil samples from the very edge of the contaminated watershed. They were independent forensic auditors. The ruthless corporate cleaners dispatched by major financial institutions when an investment portfolio suddenly turns radioactive. They moved with absolute, terrifying efficiency, and they made a deliberate, calculated point to completely avoid any visual or verbal contact with Vance or his security personnel. The invisible blockade immediately drove Vance into a state of frantic, aggressive paranoia. His usual swagger morphed into a dangerous, unpredictable volatility. He spent hours furiously pacing outside his climate-controlled mobile office, aggressively tapping at his tablet. The secure, high-priority emails he was desperately sending up the chain of command to the regional headquarters in Chicago were bouncing back with automated failure notices. The direct phone lines to his uncle on the executive board were going straight to automated voicemail. Isolated and bleeding authority, Vance resorted to the only tactic he understood: brute force and intimidation. He called an emergency. Mandatory assembly inside the main engineering tent. The air inside the canvas structure was thick, hot, and smelled strongly of nervous sweat and stale coffee. Vance stood at the front of the room, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy red, violently berating the senior engineering staff for the sudden logistical failures he refused to understand. Eventually, his manic, bloodshot eyes locked onto me. Standing quietly near the back exit, he stormed down the center aisle, violently shoving a folding chair out of his way, and slammed a single, crisp sheet of paper down onto a nearby steel table. It was a legally binding environmental compliance waiver, predated for that exact morning. The bold text clearly stated that the undersigned certified the testing grounds to be completely safe, stable, and entirely free of any hazardous chemical runoff. He shoved a heavy metal pen toward my chest. "Sign it right now, Morales," he barked, his voice cracking with a desperate, furious authority. "You are going to sign this paper confirming the land is completely safe, or I'm going to ruin your life before the sun goes down." I looked down at the fraudulent document, then slowly raised my eyes to meet his frantic, sweat-beaded face. I did not reach for the pen. I kept my hands loosely clasped in front of me, maintaining a posture of absolute, unshakable calm. "I must decline that request," I stated, my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single person in the suffocating tent could hear the steady rhythm of my words. "I am still waiting on the final results from the independent control samples. It would be a severe violation of federal protocol to verify the integrity of this land without that critical data." Vance completely lost his mind. He struck the steel table with his closed fist so hard that the heavy metal pen launched into the air and clattered across the concrete floor. The loud, sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent, terrified crowd. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. "You are completely finished," he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. We are hosting the biggest merger press conference in the history of this industry right out there on that field. The moment the cameras start rolling, you are officially terminated. Pack your pathetic little lab and get off my property by sunrise." He spun around and stormed out of the tent, leaving behind a heavy, terrified silence. I did not pack a single box. I returned to my quiet, dimly lit shipping container and waited as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the toxic, dying fields in a bruised, violet light. I sat in the darkness, watching the blinking cursor on my terminal. Shortly after midnight, the secure server pinged with a single, encrypted notification. I opened the message. It was a sterile, completely untitled email originating directly from the anonymous V-Alpha-01 account. There were no corporate letterheads, no formal greetings, and no signatures. It contained only two short, perfectly structured sentences that crystallized my absolute victory. "The sample has been confirmed. Hold your position tomorrow morning." I closed the laptop, a cold, predatory smile finally breaking across my face in the dark. Knowing that the morning sun would bring absolute devastation to the man who thought he owned the world. The dawn broke with a cruel, mocking brilliance. Mother Nature, it seemed, had a deeply twisted sense of irony after weeks of suffocating, gloomy drizzle. The sun rose over Crimson Valley in a blazing spectacle of clear, cloudless blue skies. It was the absolute perfect weather for a highly publicized corporate victory lap. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Vance had transformed the muddy, contaminated center of Sector 4 into a sickeningly lavish outdoor amphitheater. A massive, raised wooden stage covered in pristine green artificial turf completely masked the dying earth beneath it. Huge, high-definition digital screens flanked the podium, displaying the sleek, vibrant green logos of Verticore Synthetics next to the golden crest of the multinational conglomerate poised to purchase us. A fleet of local news vans was parked tightly along the gravel perimeter. Technicians frantically ran thick black cables through the dirt, setting up heavy broadcast cameras and testing audio feeds for the live stream that was scheduled to be broadcasted directly to the regional business networks. Vance stood at the absolute center of this ridiculous circus, glowing under the warm sunlight and the bright camera flashes. He was dressed in a ridiculously expensive, custom-tailored navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that probably cost more than my entire monthly salary. He looked like a triumphant conqueror, completely oblivious to the rotting foundation he was standing on. I stood quietly at the very edge of the gathered crowd, my hands tucked deep into the pockets of my worn field jacket. The media personnel, the sycophantic middle managers, and the bewildered field engineers all formed a tight semicircle around the stage. At exactly 9 o'clock, Vance stepped up to the crystal-clear acrylic podium. He flashed a brilliant, perfectly practiced, predatory smile at the flashing camera lenses and began to speak. His voice boomed through the massive concert-grade speakers, echoing across the desolate valley. "Welcome, distinguished guests, members of the press, and the hard-working visionaries of our great company. Today, we do not just announce a successful trial. We are standing at the absolute precipice of a brand new era of agriculture. The incredible breakthroughs we have finalized right here, in this very soil, will feed the future. It is a future built on absolute efficiency, unyielding innovation, and the courage to push past outdated boundaries." He paused, letting the heavy rehearsed words hang in the air for maximum dramatic effect. Then, his cold eyes swept over the heads of the reporters and locked directly onto mine. His smile tightened into a vicious, knowing smirk. "Of course," Vance continued, his tone dropping into a smooth, menacing cadence. "True progress requires absolute commitment. As we move forward into this historic $5 billion merger, we must critically evaluate our internal structures. We must be willing to permanently eliminate any weak links, any outdated individuals who stubbornly hinder our development and refuse to see the bigger picture. We are trimming the fat to build a sleeker, unstoppable machine." A polite, nervous applause rippled through the crowd of executives. Vance raised his hands, Soaking in the false adoration, he opened his mouth to deliver his final, triumphant closing statement. He never got the chance. A low mechanical rumble began to vibrate deep beneath our boots. It was not a sudden explosion, but a heavy rhythmic thrumming that slowly built in intensity, drowning out the gentle morning breeze. The crowd fell completely silent, their eyes darting around in confusion. Then came the sharp, unmistakable hiss of highly pressurized air. Nobody besides me knew about the late-night modifications I had made to the central irrigation mainframe. Following the cryptic instructions embedded in the encrypted email I had received, I had silently reprogrammed the automated field misting system. I bypassed the standard hydration schedules and activated a highly classified emergency diagnostic protocol. It was a failsafe originally designed by the biochemical engineers to visually track catastrophic chemical leaks, a feature Vance had ordered disabled on his very first day, because he thought the testing chemicals were too expensive to waste on routine safety drills. All across the vast, open expanse of Sector 4, dozens of towering steel irrigation sprinklers simultaneously erupted. Instead of a fine, clear mist of pure water, the high-pressure nozzles blasted out a thick, heavy spray of specialized reactive chemical reagent. The liquid arched high into the bright morning sky, catching the sunlight in a bizarre, unnatural way. The moment the mist made contact with the contaminated mud, the silent, invisible truth of my buried report roared into violent, undeniable existence. A massive, terrifying chemical reaction instantly swept across the entire testing field. The earth did not just change color, it violently illuminated. Wherever the reagent touched the unstable superfertilizer leaking through the soil, it instantly flashed into a brilliant, glowing, horrific shade of fluorescent, blood red. It was absolute visual pandemonium. It looked as if the earth itself had been deeply wounded and was heavily bleeding out under the morning sun. The vibrant, unnatural red sludge bubbled and frothed, releasing a sudden, overwhelming cloud of foul, sulfurous steam that rolled directly toward the pristine stage. The media crews completely lost their minds. Cameramen violently shoved each other out of the way, aggressively zooming their heavy lenses right past Vance and focusing entirely on the horrifying, bleeding landscape stretching out for miles behind him. Reporters began shouting frantic, panicked questions into their microphones, their voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy of sudden journalistic gold. The live stream, originally intended to be a boring corporate victory lap, was now broadcasting an undeniable, catastrophic ecological disaster directly to thousands of horrified investors. Vance dropped his expensive microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a deafening, high-pitched squeal of feedback that made everyone flinch. The color completely drained from his perfectly tanned face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. He spun around, staring at the glowing red nightmare swallowing his perfect stage. "Shut it down!" Vance screamed, his voice breaking into a high, hysterical shriek. He lunged off the stage, violently grabbing the collar of his lead site engineer. "Turn off the water right now! Shut the main valves! Cut the power to the entire grid!" The engineer, pale and trembling, sprinted toward the main control terminal situated near the edge of the stage. His fingers flew across the keyboard, desperately trying to override the system. A few seconds later, he looked up, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. "I cannot do it, sir," the engineer yelled over the roaring hiss of the sprinklers and the shouting crowd. "We are completely locked out. The on-site servers have been entirely hijacked. Someone has seized administrative control from an external source. The system is ignoring all physical commands." Vance looked as if he was going to vomit. He clawed at his own hair, completely ruining his perfect grooming, spinning around in circles as the bright red mist began to drift over his expensive suit, staining the pristine white fabric. The sheer chaos reached a deafening crescendo, and then, tearing straight through the manic shouting and the hissing chemical spray, came the heavy, aggressive roar of massive engines. A convoy of 4 identical, heavily armored, pitch-black sports utility vehicles, came violently tearing down the main access road. They were not moving at a safe, regulated speed. They were practically flying over the uneven gravel, kicking up massive clouds of dust. They did not even bother to slow down for the main security checkpoint. The lead vehicle smashed directly through the flimsy wooden barricades, snapping the ceremonial red ribbon in half and sending the decorative floral arrangements flying into the mud. The convoy slammed on their brakes right at the edge of the bleeding field, the heavy tires skidding aggressively in the gravel, forming a tight, impenetrable wall of dark metal and tinted glass between the stage and the exit. The murmurs in the crowd instantly died. The frantic reporters lowered their microphones. For a split second, the only sound was the heavy hissing of the red water. Everyone naturally assumed it was the federal authorities. They thought the Environmental Protection Agency had arrived to shut the entire operation down and make arrests. The heavy reinforced door of the lead black vehicle slowly swung open. A pair of heavy polished leather boots stepped out onto the wet gravel. It was not a local police chief. It was not a federal agent in a windbreaker. It was an older man, tall, imposing, and radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying, ruthless authority. He wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit that made Vance's bespoke outfit look like a cheap costume. His silver hair was perfectly swept back, and his piercing, storm-gray eyes swept over the chaotic scene with the cold, calculating precision of a predator identifying its prey. It was Desmond Sterling. He was the legendary, ruthless billionaire biotechnology tycoon, the absolute ruler and chief executive officer of the massive multinational conglomerate that was supposed to buy our company, but infinitely more important to the terrified, shaking man standing on the ruined stage. Desmond Sterling was Vance's own blood relative. He was the immensely powerful uncle who had secured Vance his position, the silent backer who had funded his entire arrogant existence. And judging by the absolute, murderous fury carved into the older man's face, the uncle had not come all the way from his corporate high-rise to celebrate a victory. He had come to execute an absolute slaughter. The absolute terror drained every single drop of blood from Vance's face. The arrogant glow he wore just moments ago vanished entirely, replaced by the sickly pallor of a cornered, desperate animal. He stumbled down the wooden steps of the ruined stage, his expensive leather shoes slipping wildly on the wet, chemical-stained artificial turf. He practically threw himself toward the imposing figure of Desmond Sterling. Vance was sweating profusely, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender and desperate appeasement. "Uncle Desmond," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high, reedy whine that was completely stripped of his usual booming authority. "Listen to me. You have to listen. This is not what it looks like. We have a disgruntled employee, a rogue analyst. Lila Morales has completely lost her mind. She sabotaged the mainframes. She hacked the irrigation grid to stage this entire disaster. I was just about to have corporate security throw her off the property." Desmond Sterling did not even blink. He did not slow his powerful, rhythmic stride, nor did he acknowledge the frantic, sweating man desperately hovering in his peripheral vision. He stepped around his own nephew with the exact same level of careless disdain one might reserve for a rotting bag of garbage left on the pavement. The complete dismissal was infinitely more brutal than any physical blow could ever be. Vance froze instantly, his mouth hanging open, entirely paralyzed by the terrifying realization that his absolute shield of family privilege had just violently shattered. The entire crowd of reporters, executives, and field workers parted like a sea in front of the billionaire. Desmond walked straight past the frantic chaos, his heavy footsteps crunching loudly on the wet gravel, making a direct line for the absolute edge of the crowd. He was walking directly toward me. I did not step back. I kept my arms firmly crossed over my chest, standing perfectly still as the most powerful man in the agricultural technology sector stopped just 2 feet away from me. Slowly, deliberately, Desmond reached up and removed his dark sunglasses, folding them and sliding them into the breast pocket of his immaculate suit. His storm-gray eyes locked onto mine, completely devoid of the fury he had shown when stepping out of his vehicle. Instead, there was a sharp, distinct glint of profound professional respect. Without a single word of introduction, he extended his large, calloused right hand. The surrounding media crews immediately sensed the dramatic shift in power. The blinding flashes of dozens of heavy cameras pivoted away from the glowing red fields and focused entirely on the two of us. I uncrossed my arms and firmly gripped his hand. Desmond turned his head slightly, ensuring his voice carried perfectly over the chaotic ambient noise and directly into the cluster of sensitive microphones held out by the nearest reporters. "Thank you, Ms. Morales," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that instantly commanded absolute silence. "If it were not for your activation code, our automated algorithms would have blindly dumped $5 billion straight into a highly toxic garbage pit." The pieces violently slammed into place in my mind. The anonymous user V-Alpha-01 was never a human auditor. It was the proprietary, hyper-advanced artificial intelligence risk assessment engine belonging to Desmond's own multinational conglomerate. By triggering the dormant Aegis node protocol, I had bypassed Verticor's corrupted internal management and beamed the raw, unfiltered truth directly into the central nervous system of the buying company. But the environmental data alone would only have triggered a standard corporate renegotiation. The true lethal blow was the digital video file. The high-definition footage of Vance maliciously grinding a critical safety report into the toxic mud proved undeniable. Premeditated management fraud. That single piece of evidence handed Desmond Sterling the ultimate legal weapon. It gave his army of corporate lawyers the absolute right to instantly terminate the original merger agreement under the severe breach of trust clause. He was now perfectly positioned to aggressively force the buyout price of Verticor Synthetics down to exactly 1/3 of its original valuation. I had not just saved the valley, I had handed this ruthless billionaire a multi-billion-dollar discount on a solid silver platter. Vance let out a guttural, panicked scream from behind us. "She is a liar!" he shrieked, sprinting forward but abruptly stopping when Desmond's massive, stone-faced personal security guards smoothly stepped into his path. Crossing their massive arms, "Uncle, she faked the data. She is trying to ruin me. You cannot believe a single word she says." Desmond slowly turned his head, dropping my hand. The look he gave his nephew was so violently cold, it seemed to instantly lower the temperature of the air around us. "You are not just profoundly stupid, Vance," Desmond stated, his voice laced with absolute venom. "You actively embarrassed me. You thought you could hide a catastrophic chemical failure under a layer of cheap artificial turf while begging for my money. The digital video of you throwing her critical safety report into the mud is currently playing on a continuous loop inside the primary executive boardrooms in New York right now. You are a complete liability." Vance began to hyperventilate, shaking his head frantically as tears of absolute terror welled up in his eyes. He opened his mouth to formulate another desperate lie, but Desmond raised a single, commanding finger, slicing through the air like a guillotine blade. Knowing perfectly well that the local news cameras were still actively broadcasting every single second of this confrontation live to the world, Desmond delivered the final, fatal strike. "Vance, you are completely fired, effective immediately," he announced coldly, "and I strongly suggest you retain a very expensive defense attorney. Prepare to face the full wrath of the Environmental Protection Agency." He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to his security detail. Two massive men in dark suits immediately lunged forward. They grabbed Vance by his arms, nearly lifting him completely off his expensive snakeskin boots. One guard ruthlessly snatched the glossy corporate identification lanyard straight off Vance's neck, tossing it carelessly into the glowing red mud. Vance began to thrash and sob, screaming out pathetic, incoherent pleas as the guards violently dragged the former regional director away from the stage, hauling him toward the exit while the entire company watched his absolute destruction in deeply satisfying silence. The frantic energy that had consumed the field abruptly evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, stunned silence. The media crews, having captured the dramatic climax of the century, hastily packed their expensive equipment and scrambled back into their vans, eager to be the first to broadcast the absolute downfall of Vance Sterling. The massive crowd of field workers, junior engineers, and sycophantic middle managers slowly dispersed. These were the exact same men who had stood in the pouring rain just days ago, laughing heartily as my dignity was ground into the toxic soil. Now, they could not even bring themselves to look me in the eye. They kept their heads bowed, offering me a wide, respectful berth as they shuffled back toward the main facility. The power dynamic of the entire valley had fundamentally shifted in a matter of minutes, and every single person present felt the undeniable weight of that sudden change. Desmond Sterling remained standing on the wet gravel, the flashing lights of the departing vehicles reflecting faintly in his sharp gray eyes. He calmly reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a sleek digital tablet. He tapped the glowing screen a few times before extending it toward me. I looked down at the display. It was not a basic severance package or a standard non-disclosure agreement. It was a comprehensive, highly detailed executive contract for the complete structural and ecological reorganization of the entire valley. He looked at me with a stark, calculating expression. He stated plainly that his corporation was about to officially acquire a massively undervalued, heavily contaminated asset. He needed a leader who actually understood the deep science of the earth, someone entirely immune to corporate flattery, and someone ruthless enough to clean up the catastrophic mess his nephew had left behind. "The position of regional director is currently vacant," Desmond said, his deep voice carrying a quiet, absolute authority that required no shouting. "Do you want to clean out his office?" I reached out and took the cold metal tablet from his hands. I looked back at the glowing, bleeding fields, and then up at the towering executive. A cold, perfectly measured smile formed on my lips. "I will gladly take the office," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of any intimidation. "But you will need to throw his expensive leather chair into the incinerator. It absolutely reeks of incompetence." Desmond let out a short, genuine bark of laughter, a rare sound that seemed to completely surprise his own security detail. He gave me a single, approving nod, turned on his heel, and walked back to his armored vehicle, leaving me standing in the sun holding the absolute keys to the kingdom. Exactly 2 weeks later, I officially walked through the heavy glass doors of the primary administrative building as the newly appointed regional director of the newly acquired company. The transition of power was swift and completely merciless. My very first executive mandate was the absolute teardown and complete restructuring of the entire ecological compliance protocol. The bloated financial budget Vance had previously used for lavish corporate retreats was instantly reallocated to the environmental remediation teams. The identical, high-visibility vested managers who had eagerly acted as the personal echo chamber for Vance now stood silently in a perfectly straight line outside my door. They nervously clutched their departmental reviews, completely obedient and desperately waiting for my daily orders. They understood clearly that the era of arrogance and willful ignorance was permanently dead. I walked into the massive, climate-controlled corner office that used to belong to the man who tried to destroy my career. The obnoxious vanity decorations were entirely gone, replaced by clean, functional workspaces and highly detailed topographic maps of our recovery zones. I stood quietly by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a warm cup of dark roast coffee. I looked out over the vast expanse of Sector 4. The violent red chemical reaction had been neutralized. Fleets of heavy decontamination vehicles were methodically stripping away the poisoned topsoil, beginning the incredibly long, arduous process of healing the devastated land. It was a monumental task, but for the first time in years, the valley was finally breathing again. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee and turned back to my massive mahogany desk. Hanging directly behind my chair, perfectly centered on the pristine white wall, was not a prestigious university diploma, a glowing letter of corporate commendation, or an expensive piece of abstract art. It was a simple, heavy glass frame. Inside the frame rested the deeply wrinkled, thoroughly yellowed, and heavily water-damaged cover page of my original risk assessment report. The thick, black, undeniable imprint of a snakeskin cowboy boot was still perfectly preserved right in the center of the paper, forever stained by the toxic mud. I hung it there as a permanent, silent warning to every single executive, manager, or auditor who would ever step foot inside my office. It is a fundamental law of nature and business alike. Never throw the brutal truth into the dirt. If you try to bury the truth in the mud, it will only take deep root, grow stronger in the darkness, and inevitably rise up to completely destroy you. Thank you so very much, dear listeners, for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story empowering and satisfying, please consider supporting our work by joining the Patreon channel of Boss Revenge Stories. There, you can listen to the absolute best, highly exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join our community by scanning the code on your screen or by clicking the direct link provided in the video description or the pinned comment.